Your teams have been drafted. The games have kicked off. Now the real fun begins. Today I'm taking you through my week 1 starts and sits to help you win your opening matchups on the Fantasy First Down. It's here. The fantasy season has finally started, and boy, have we had a couple of fun games to kick things off. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, would be great if you could like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. If you want to check out the visual of my rankings, you can go to my Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. My Twitter is Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can check out all of my rankings on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com, plus my articles at football.rasball.com. Today we're going through week 1 starts and sits, and I've personally got a slightly different take on how starts and sits should work. Most people just say these guys are starts and these guys are sits, but it doesn't really work that way. Realistically, you have to know how good a guy is relative to all the other players on your roster. So I'm going to go through my rankings and I'm going to highlight the guys that I think are particularly higher or lower that maybe you wouldn't ordinarily be starting, but you are this week. So we'll go through it. I'll show you how it works, and we'll get into some start sits for week 1 of the fantasy season. And the graphic's going to look kind of like this. So basically, I've got my rankings up. If they're green, that means that player is ranked higher than usual because there's something about their matchup or their situation that I particularly like. And if it's red, obviously it's the other way around. That means that player is probably a sit for me this week, and I'm significantly less interested in them than I would be otherwise. I'm starting things off, and you can already see quite a few of these guys have played already. Realistically, we know how Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and guys like that went. But all the other usual names are up there as well. Josh Allen, Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud. You're starting all of those guys. You're probably starting Kyler Murray, even though it's an awkward situation week 1. And obviously Jordan Love's played as well. But the two other guys there of interest are Trevor Lawrence and Jaden Daniels. And they both get some pretty solid matchups. Trevor Lawrence takes on the Dolphins, and the Dolphins have been known to ship quite a few points in the past. And I do feel like in this situation, it is very possible that we get a very high-scoring game, and that's really going to help Lawrence. I feel like they're going to have to pass the ball. I feel like they might fall behind early. We know how many points the Dolphins can score, and I feel like the Jaguars are going to have to be pretty aggressive in their passing game to keep up with them. So for me, Lawrence is a guy that you wouldn't ordinarily be starting, that you can start over a couple of guys who've fallen a little bit this week. I also typically don't like starting rookie quarterbacks. I'm very scared of starting Jaden Daniels, but he's playing against Tampa, and Tampa realistically has one of the best run defenses they have for years, and I don't see that changing. They've still had most of their guys come back, and they've got a pretty iffy secondary as well. So for that reason, I do feel like Daniels could be quite productive, not so much in the passing game, but in the scrambling game. I do feel like he's going to be quite active. We could see a Lamar Jackson type situation. He is essentially a Lamar Jackson light, or arguably a Lamar Jackson heavy, depending on how you look at it. And I do think that this week could be a week that we see him go quite well, but he's always going to be risky because this is ultimately his first NFL game. So he's a risky start, but for me, I still prefer him over the next set of guys. And if we go below here, we can see a whole lot of other guys that I think are good starts this week. Obviously, Tua is on the other side of that Dolphins-Jags game. And we also know that the Jags can be a team that you can attack through the air. They were 7th best matchup against quarterbacks last season, and I see no reason to think that won't continue this week. Jared Goff obviously gets... Well, he's always got the opportunity to score a lot of points, Jared Goff. Realistically, we saw Detroit be very aggressive at times last season. Their secondary really struggled, and so they conceded a lot of points. And this week, he faces the Rams, and the Rams were the 3rd best matchup against opposing quarterbacks. So there is an argument that he even could be in the top 10. I do feel like he could have a good game. The problem is, do they just keep it on the ground and run? I think they probably don't. The Rams do have a pretty good run defense. They're the 2nd best run defense fantasy-wise last season against running backs. So I do feel like they're going to have to attack through the air. We just haven't really seen it happen yet this season. So I'm easing off Goff a little bit for that reason. He's still a very good starting option. Baker Mayfield takes on the Commanders. Commanders were the 2nd easiest matchup against quarterbacks last season. So I do feel like he's going to have a good game. And on the other side of that Goff situation, you've obviously got Matthew Stafford, who gets that really weak Detroit secondary. I know they've brought some new guys in like Terry and Arnold, but I still think they're going to be very attackable. And I do think that Matthew Stafford is a solid option when ordinarily he wouldn't even be on your roster. Now, the guys that you're not starting that you probably should be, and to be fair, I'm not saying you should necessarily drop these guys or drop someone else to pick up one of the green guys. I'm simply saying that if you've got both of these guys in your roster, that I would start the guy in green. I would start the guys ranked 11 to 14 over guys like Joe Burrow, Brock Purdy, and Dak Prescott, who would usually be starters. Now, there are going to be situations where you don't want to drop someone off your bench, especially in week one, where we don't know how usage is going to be. And there's going to be some very, very valuable waiver pickups. If you can get that guy onto your bench, there's a lot of value in that. And especially with someone like Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow is very close to these other guys. The reason he's quite low down, there's no T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase hasn't really been practicing much. He's only really started practicing in the last day or so. We don't even have a guarantee he's going to play, though he near surely will. So this is not an ideal situation for Burrow. I don't feel good about him this week. I'm very nervous about what this game could look like, and he takes on the Patriots. They're not going to need to throw the ball a lot. They could keep it on the ground. It could be one of those grind fests where we see a really low-scoring game. So it's hard to feel particularly good about Joe Burrow in this situation. There's a lot of concerns there. For that reason, he's lower for me. Caleb Williams, likewise, unlike Jaden Daniels, he goes into a situation where if he's going to score points, he probably will have to pass the ball. I can't imagine he's going to do most of his work on the ground in this situation. So for that reason, even though he's taking on the Titans, who are traditionally a pretty good matchup for quarterbacks, they're really not this season. You can pass on them a little bit, but they've really improved their secondary. And for the most part, it was wide receivers that succeeded against them last season. The quarterbacks themselves didn't score a lot of points for whatever reason. They really were very good, short, close to the line of scrimmage. You need to attack them over the top. And that meant that a lot of quarterbacks struggled to put up points last season against the Titans. So don't feel particularly good about Caleb Williams on debut. Brock Purdy's in an awkward situation because Brandon Ayuk's only just came back. We don't know exactly how this offense is going to look. And they take on the Jets, who have a fantastic secondary there. I mean, to be fair, you didn't have to throw on the Jets last season. They were usually losing, but it was the third toughest quarterback matchup last season. Most teams could run on them, and we know if there's a team that can run, it's the 49ers with Christian McCaffrey, and they'll probably bring Jordan Mason in there as well. So you've got to feel bad about Brock Purdy this week. It's very hard to start him. I just don't feel good about that situation. Dak Prescott turned up a lot lower for me than I expected. He was very high in my rankings this season, but I'm concerned about the CeeDee Lamb only just coming back and potentially not being ready yet. I'm also concerned about the matchup against the Browns. I feel like they could be very good against quarterbacks this season. They were kind of okay last season, but they dealt with a lot of injuries, and they still managed to be the fourth toughest matchup. I feel like they might be even better this season. So for that reason, I'm easing off Dak, and I'm also easing off Deshaun Watson and most of the Browns as well, because I feel like that could be quite a low-scoring encounter between two good defensive teams. You've also heard me talk up Kirk Cousins quite a lot, and ordinarily Cousins would be an option in a lot of these situations, but I just feel like against the Steelers have a very good defensive structure. I feel like they could be even more improved this season defensively. Last season, they were kind of like an okay matchup across the board. I think they might be better this year. And so for that reason, I'm trying to avoid Cousins if I can. There's certainly better options I like. Daniel Jones is like a low-end guy. You can probably start in either a really deep league or in a super flex league. You might have him, and he might be a guy you'd start when you ordinarily wouldn't. I think that Giants game could end up being a far more high-scoring game than we expect. They obviously take on the Vikings, and I do think both Jones and Darnold could be involved in a little bit of a shootout there, depending on how things happen. Could go the other way in that game as well, so not really willing to put my cards fully on that, but I feel like they're viable super flex options. Justin Fields also appears there because I just don't know that Russell Wilson's going to start. I'm quite nervous about that situation. If Wilson does start, he's going to be well lower than this, but I feel like Fields has more fantasy upside, even though he's a worse quarterback. The reason, of course, being that they're taking on the Falcons. Falcons are very difficult to pass on, but as a rushing quarterback, I still feel like he's going to be able to produce. Let's move on to the running backs. Look, all the usual names you'd expect up the top there. A little bit annoyed. I had Saquon Barkley at 5, and I moved him down at the last minute. Don't know why I did that. Definitely have regrets on that. But look, you started these guys anyway. There's not many teams where you're not starting any of those top 7 guys. The surprise names are 8 to 10 there, and let me talk you through each of those. So James Cook takes on the Cardinals. The Cardinals are the easiest rushing matchup in the league. Realistically, they conceded the most points to running backs last season. I do think they'll improve a little bit, but we still expect the Bills to rush a lot on the Cardinals. We expect them to win and win relatively easily. So for that reason, James Cook is a strong start for me this week. Kenneth Walker, likewise, takes on the Broncos. He also gets a fantastic matchup. They conceded the second most points against running backs last season. No reason to think that won't happen again this season. So both of those guys would usually be like solid RB2s, and you're kind of starting them in a lot of leagues. I think in this season they should be starting in week 1 in every single league. I can't imagine many situations where you have 3 guys above them and you can't start any of them. They're all really strong starts, even in PPR. Most of these rankings are half PPR, but they really transfer very well across to PPR. If you got questions about PPR situations, of course, make sure you leave something in the comments or you can message me on Instagram. Alvin Kamara is also significantly higher up than you'd expect because guess who's very good against running backs, or at least 4 opposing running backs? That's the Panthers. Top 5 for opposing running backs facing the Panthers. They also were very difficult to pass on last season, or at least teams didn't pass on. That's probably a better way of putting them because the Panthers were kind of trash last season. I think that probably will be this season as well. So I think we see a bit of a grind fest there. I think you see a lot of Alvin Kamara, a little bit of Jamal Williams, and an annoying amount of Taysom Hill, unless you have Taysom Hill, of course. And he might pop up as a start later on. Now, the guys obviously dropping down because we have those guys move up. Jahmyr Gibbs against the Rams. Rams, very difficult to run on last season. They don't have Aaron Donald now. But I do think they're still going to have a very good run defense. I think you're going to have to pass on them. That was how teams attacked them last season. I think it will still happen. Now, to be fair, Jahmyr Gibbs is still going to be involved in the passing game. So I feel like he's still going to be a solid option. But Gibbs and Montgomery are guys that I'm avoiding if I can. I just don't really see a point. Montgomery is probably going to get many of the goal line carries. So there's at least a little bit of upside there because, like I said, this could be a shootout. But it's hard to believe that the running backs are going to be strong starters in this game. And Montgomery's got a guy you could arguably consider a sit as well. Kyren Williams on the other side of that game, again, the Lions, very good defensively against the run. This is going to be a game that's got a lot of passing. These are the 2 teams that were the hardest for opposing running backs in fantasy last season. They were worst and second worst opposing running back scores against those 2 teams last season. So I expect Gibbs and Williams will both struggle. And for that reason, hard to start them. Plus, we don't know what Kyren Williams' situation is. How much is Blake Corum going to be involved? Would kind of be nice to see that if we have the choice. So we can start one of the guys ahead of them. Then I would consider sitting these guys. They'd have to be in a pretty shallow league or have a pretty loaded team to be able to sit any of these guys. We saw that Derrick Henry obviously struggled against the Chiefs. Kind of saw that one coming. Got lucky with a touchdown and a lot of volume. Same thing with Isaiah Pacheco. Didn't run very well. We got a little bit lucky with the touchdown. Now, no real other surprise names in there. Devon Achan's a little bit lower than most people would expect, but I just don't like Achan particularly. I think that Mostert's probably the better player for me. That's where they would be most weeks. It's nothing special in particular about this Jaguars matchup. The Jaguars are kind of like middle of the road against running backs. I feel like you're probably better off being a wide receiver or a quarterback against the Jags. But, I mean, the running backs will still be okay. I just think it's going to be one of those games where both running backs are involved roughly equally. I've just got Achan a little bit higher because he does have that upside that maybe the Dolphins get a bit of a lead, and then it's usually Achan that they use in that situation. James Conner a little bit higher than usual, simply because I think we could see a rather conservative game plan by the Cardinals, and that would mean a lot of James Conner. Javonte Williams is a name that's a lot higher, and he's someone that I would consider a traditional start-sit style start. That's a lot of STs in that sentence. Look, Williams has a fantastic matchup against the Seahawks. For me, he's the number 1 guy there. I don't feel confident about that, but I feel good enough to consider him a start. It's a matchup where he is, where the Seahawks were the 3rd easiest team to score on fantasy points wise. They also conceded the most opposing touchdowns to running backs. Plus, they conceded the 2nd most yards to running backs. Note that that's on the ground, and that's really going to help Javonte Williams, who's going to have mainly that role, while Jaleel McLaughlin, who's also a solid option this week in a deeper league, he's going to be doing most of the receiving work and change of pace work. I don't think we see a lot of Audric Estime. I also don't think we see any other guys getting involved like a Blake Watson. Obviously, there's no smudge AP run there anymore. Gus Edwards is also a solid start. Against the Raiders, it's not so much the Raiders matchup. The Raiders, it is easier to run on them than pass on them, but they're still solid against the run. It's just, I think we're going to see a lot of run this game. I think we're going to see Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins both heavily involved, and so they're both significantly higher for me than they ordinarily would be. So they're solid starts for me as well. A couple of other guys to mention there. Jerome Fawn's kind of like an okay option, but don't get overly excited that he's the starter because it's an awkward matchup against Dallas. He will be involved, but it's possible that Donta Foreman comes in and takes the goal line work, and that will obviously limit Ford's upside. So he's one that I'm a little bit nervous about. Zamir White, we don't really know what his workload looks like, so that's why I've got him a little bit lower than you might expect. Chuba Hubbard just gets an awkward matchup, which is why he's a bit lower. And then we see all these guys that are in committees. We see the Tony Pollards. Obviously, he and Ty J. Spears. I think the Pollard probably does better against the Bears. I feel like it's the sort of matchup where we see a little bit more of Pollard. Harris against Jalen Warren. I just think that because Warren's coming back from injury, we'll see more from Harris than we usually would, but it's still a bad matchup against the Falcons. I think that Warren should arguably be considered a sit as well. He probably should be read. Against the Falcons, we know the Falcons are hard to move the ball on in general, so I do think that potentially we don't see a great game out of either Harris or Warren. Moss and Chase Brown against the Patriots. I think we probably see slightly more Chase Brown than we would most weeks, but Moss is still the lead back for me relatively. The big surprise there is probably that Brian Robinson Jr. is behind Austin Eckler. That's because it's so hard to run on the Bucs. I feel like you're going to see more checkdowns and more Eckler style play than early down rushing from Brian Robinson Jr. I feel like he's going to have one of those games that we've seen from him occasionally against this sort of defense where he rushes the ball like 12 times and has like 20 yards. It just feels in the realm of possibility. I would definitely consider starting a J.K. Dobbins over him, for example, especially in a PPR league. Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle a little bit lower again. I just feel like that's going to be a low-scoring game. It's an awkward situation. Don't particularly love either of those guys. If you're looking for a real deep option, guys are like, Justice Hill is someone that I was actually talking about earlier, but too late for that now. Ty Chandler in a similar situation where I feel like he could get a lot more touches than most people expect against the Giants. It wouldn't surprise me if they actually use those guys a lot more. We don't really know exactly how healthy Jordan Addison is. It's possible that Justin Jefferson gets a lot of double coverage, so the other guys are going to have opportunities to get involved. Also, someone like a Jamal Williams, way higher than he usually would be, but I don't know that I can really consider him a start. I think he's someone that you can use if you're absolutely desperate because he's probably available. Alexander Madison, also way higher than usual. I think you're going to find he's more involved than most people expect. Let's talk the wide receivers. Obviously, all the usual names you expect up here, the usual suspects. Mike Evans, way higher than most people. Now, to be fair, I was already high on Mike Evans. I love Mike Evans coming into the season. He was a top 10 wide receiver for me. That's because he's been a top 10 wide receiver, at least a top 12 wide receiver the last, 7 or 8 years. He's just really good. And I think this week against one of the easiest matchups for outside wide receivers against the Commanders, who haven't really added great strength to their outside cornerbacks. They've got Michael Davis there now. They got Benjamin St-Juste, but they actually brought in a slot corner in Mike Sainristil. So I feel like their secondary is still going to struggle. It was poor last season. It's still going to be poor this season. They brought in Jeremy Chin, but he wasn't even starting consistently last season, and Quan Martin's yet to prove himself either. They're the safety. So I feel like that whole secondary is going to be poor, and that means you're going to see quite a bit of Mike Evans. He's got massive upside for me. He could have a very quiet game. We have seen last season at times, every time Mike Evans had a matchup that should be very good, he struggled, and every time he had a matchup that should be very difficult, he put up crazy numbers. So he could have a really good game, or he could have a very average game, but the upside is massive, and you just have to start him. CeeDee Lamb's lower than usual, but you're still starting CeeDee Lamb, realistically. I can't imagine a situation where you got enough of those 5 guys ahead of him to not be starting Lamb. Just realize, lower your expectations on he and also Jamar Chase a little bit. A lot of people have Puka Nacua higher than this, or at least in this range. I like Nacua better than I like Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp's actually higher in consensus on ECR, which is really weird on Fantasy Pros. I don't see that at all. We saw last season when they both played, Nacua is still the clear number one. And against Detroit, I don't really know that Kupp's style is really the target against Detroit. I feel like Nacua could be the better player, but Kupp is still higher than he usually would be. It's a great matchup for both of them. You're ideally starting both of those guys. Other guys that are higher than usual, Malik Neighbors, I like against the Vikings. The Vikings have been quite susceptible against the pass. We saw last season that they considered the sixth most points. I feel like Neighbors is going to be good. They're also quite susceptible against the slot, so don't be surprised if Wandale Robinson has a big game, but you'd have to be in a pretty deep league before he becomes an option. Rasheed Rice has obviously already played. We saw that panned out. Chris Godwin is way higher than he usually would be against the Commanders. Same deal as Mike Evans. Obviously, he's in the slot, but while the Commanders have been better in the slot previously, they've got a rookie there in his first game. And we saw in the earlier games of week one that when there's a rookie quarterback out there, they're going to make mistakes and you're going to score points against them and they're probably going to target them there. So it wouldn't surprise me if they use more Godwin than you would expect and that he also has a good game. Diggs a little bit higher against the Colts. You can attack them through the air. I already talked about the Dolphins. Christian Kirk will be the main beneficiary there. And we obviously saw Jaden Reed already had a big game as well. So some of these already coming through, even though I made these graphics earlier. Deebo Samuel is someone I've got lower, and Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk's a lot lower. The reason Ayuk's lower is, of course, is he hasn't been practicing. So I feel like he might be limited in his snaps and his usage as well. Wouldn't surprise me if they punish him a little bit for being so annoying. Yeah, I don't feel like you can get away from Deebo fully. I feel like Ayuk's a guy that you could avoid starting in certain situations. The Jets are just such a tough matchup. They've got really good cornerbacks. The defense in general is excellent. It's going to be hard to score on them through the air. I feel like they'll be able to scheme up Deebo in a couple of ways. In the same way they're going to use McCaffrey, they'll get the ball to Deebo close to the line of scrimmage, and that's where he can be dangerous. And I do feel like he's going to get more touches that way as well. But look, I would certainly be avoiding Ayuk if I could. The other guys I'm a little bit lower on, all of the Seahawks, realistically, you can run on Denver so well that they're not going to need to pass the ball. And they've already kind of come out and said that Grubb's going to want to establish a run first. In fact, DK Metcalf himself said that they're going to want to establish the run first and then pass from there. And some weeks that's going to be fantastic for Metcalf. It's going to create a lot of space for him. He's going to become more efficient. But I think there's also going to be weeks where that means he's going to be very quiet. And I feel like this could be one of those weeks. DJ Moore in Caleb Williams' first week. That's not an ideal situation. Usually really like players against the Titans' outside cornerbacks, but they brought in L'Jarius Sneed, who's very good. They brought in Awuzie, who is solid. So I feel like their secondary could be improved enough that that's no longer an area of weakness for them. And for that reason, don't really particularly want to start more if you can help it. Cooper obviously lower as well. I already talked about the Browns players against Dallas. George Pickens falls a little bit. Arguably could go even lower than this against Atlanta. That's just such a tough matchup. I feel like he's probably going to see quite a bit of AJ Terrell. So that's not who you want to be going up against. He's quite a good cover corner, in my opinion. I think he's underrated. Jacoby Myers is a guy I'm way higher on than most people, especially this week. Love that matchup against the Chargers. The Chargers are someone you can attack, especially in the slot. Consider the third most wide receiver points last season, as I said earlier, for Adams. So, look, Myers is an option in a deeper league, or if you're a little bit desperate, if you've lost, say, a T. Higgins or something like that, you need to replace him. Myers might even be available on waivers. In a lot of leagues, he will be, especially 10-team leagues and some 12-team leagues. So he's an option if you are desperate for wide receiver help. A little bit lower than usual on the Seahawks, as I said, plus DeAndre Hopkins coming back from injury. That's not really a situation I want to approach. Keon Coleman I've been higher on all season, but against the Cardinals, they're not going to need to throw that much. So for that reason, I'm not really starting him in most leagues, even though I have a lot of him. I just want to see it happen first. I do expect him to be the every down wide receiver, but that doesn't mean he's going to be heavily involved in the passing game. No other big surprises there. I think everyone's roughly where they belong in most weeks. Tight ends. No real surprises up the top, even though, as it turns out, I was very wrong on Mark Andrews. I don't think anyone really saw that coming. Most of the guys there are where you'd expect them. Pretty high on George Kittle this week. We do see that the Jets concede a lot of points against tight ends. I can imagine a situation where you're sitting Kittle anyway. But if you're considering it, know that tight end is the easiest way to attack the Jets if you're going to do it through the air. So I do feel like it's probably going to be a McCaffrey and Kittle game with a little bit of underneath work to Deebo. I really wanted to have Evan Ingram a little bit higher as well. I felt like this could be a good game, and I feel like he has a higher floor than a lot of the guys around him. And I would have him higher if it was based on floor, but that's not how Fantasy Pros ranking points work. You kind of have to rank for upside, and that's why Ingram's a little bit low. But if you're looking for safety, I feel like Ingram is a good option. I feel like he could have a solid game. Kincaid's obviously fine. Kyle Pitts lower than usual. He's been battling injury. I'm a little bit worried that he might be on a bit of a snap count. Plus, against the Steelers, it's just a little bit of a tricky matchup. It's not that the Steelers are terrible against tight ends or great against tight ends. They're right middle of the road. They're 16th. But it's just not an ideal situation. So he's lower than the other guys, but you still kind of have to start him. The guys that I'm sitting at in certain situations I wouldn't usually be. David Njoku is one. I just feel like that whole game against the Cowboys is going to be messy. In PPR, I'm still starting him, but in a half PPR and certainly a non-PPR, I feel like I can go out and get Taysom Hill. Now, should you drop Njoku for him? No, definitely not. Taysom Hill's not going to be good most weeks. This is purely because of this matchup. In this matchup, I would consider in half PPR specifically starting Hill ahead of Njoku. I wouldn't do that in most games, and I wouldn't do that in most leagues, especially a PPR league. I certainly don't think you want to be dropping someone off your roster to grab Hill if you've got a strong upside option there. I feel like they're close enough that you don't need to do that. But if you have Hill already or Hill's available and you have an empty spot because you're wasting it with, I don't know, a DST or a kicker or something dumb or a spare quarterback, then go pick up Hill and start him this week because the upside's huge. They're going to need to run on the Panthers a lot unless the Panthers are suddenly doing something very different, which would be unexpected, but it is possible with the new coaching staff. I do think that Taysom is going to be a productive player this week. I've got him quite high. Other guys below him, Jake Ferguson, same situation. It's going to be a low-scoring game. Brock Bowers on debut. It's really hard to be a rookie tight end. We just don't know what that's going to look like. I feel like he's going to have a good season, but I don't particularly want to start him this week if I can avoid it. Also, the Chargers defense is best against tight ends. I mean, look, tight ends still score at top 15th most points against them. It's just the Chargers have been weaker against other positions. So for that reason, avoiding Bowers if I can. I'm quite high on Noah Fant. The Broncos are a team you can attack over the middle there. And so for that reason, I think he's a good option. They conceded the most points to tight ends last season, the Broncos. So yeah, I think you're probably going to see them attack the Broncos through their running backs, but I do think Fant could have a solid game. He's a better option than a Pat Frymuth, who I just have no interest in. I feel like we're going to see a lot of Arthur Smith rubbish where you get a whole heap of Darnell Washington and Michael Pruitt and Connor Hayward's out there for no particularly good reason, some snaps. And look, I know they paid Frymuth quite a bit of money, but I just feel like they're going to waste him. I don't like this situation. It makes me feel really awkward. Usually you can attack Atlanta over the middle like that, but I just don't want Frymuth this season in general. I'm probably going to have him even lower most weeks, honestly. In fact, this is high for me, but I'm mentioning him here as a sit because a lot of people I've seen around are starting him, especially people who showed me their lineups. Colby Parkinson, I'm a little bit bold on this week. It's not because there's anything special about Detroit against tight ends. Arguably, they're better against wide receivers, but I feel like he might be their third pass catcher, and I think that could be productive. Cole Kmet, I'm lower, not again because of the matchup against Tennessee, although also because of the matchup against Tennessee, they concede the least points against opposing tight ends, but primarily because I think that Cole Kmet's not going to be a clear starter. I feel like he's going to split with Gerald Everett, and you're not going to want him. So that's why I've got him a little bit lower. Realistically, not starting most of these tight ends outside the top 12 or 13 guys anyway. And that's all we've got for week one. If you have questions, hit me up either in the comments below, and hopefully you like and subscribe as well. You can hit me up on Instagram. I always get a heap of messages on Instagram. I try to make sure I answer them as soon as I can. Just note that once the games actually start, I'm going to go offline. Firstly, because I live in Australia and it's nighttime. And secondly, because I want to watch the games without being spoiled. And so for that reason, I would usually watch them on a bit of a delay so I can analyze them properly. And so I won't get to messages after the games have started. So if you've got any start sets, just message me before the games actually start. My Instagram is at the Fantasy First Down. Twitter is at Fantasy First Down with no O. Instagram's your best bet if you want messages on game day. The website's ffdfantasyfootball.com. I'll have that updated right going into the game. And you can also check out my start sit article at football.rasball.com. I've got a couple of deeper options if you're in really deeper leagues, but you'll have to check out the article for that as well. I'm also doing a slot versus wide analysis on Rasball. I'm on the Rasball show on what will be Saturday night. In the US, it will be Friday night most weeks, but this week's it's Saturday night. So if you're interested in that, go check out the Rasball Fantasy YouTube channel as well. Other than that, look, good luck in week 1. And most importantly, just enjoy it. It's fun to have football back. I hope you are enjoying it as well. I will see you next time.